Hello and welcome to the session on Philosophy of Language, Mid-Century Revolutions. In the last two units on Philosophy of Language, we have looked the early beginning of the philosophy of language and the later developments in the early 20th century. We have already looked at the works and ideas of Bertrand Russell and Gottlob Frege. We have also looked at in detail logical positivism, the influence of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and the semantic theory of truth by Alfred Tarski. We have seen that all these philosophers and movements contributed greatly to the emergence and development of the philosophy of language. By the middle of the 20th century, the approach developed by Frege and Russell had become very strong with the developments brought forward by the logical positivists. The Second World War had a very serious impact on the development of philosophy of language. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany and Nazism saw logical positivism with hostility. It was a hard time for the philosophers of logical positivism. Many of them were forced to immigrate. Moritz Schlick, who was the chair of Vienna Circle, and Grilling were murdered during that time. With the migration of these scholars to the United States, it becomes the new home for many of the logical positivists. The spread of logical positivism in the USA occurred throughout the 1930s. In 1932, the American Philosophical Association started associating with logical positivists and they organized a discussion on the philosophy of logical positivism. In the middle of the political changes happening, logical positivists had a good environment in the USA. As a result of this, the ideas of logical positivism spread outside of Europe. They established relationships with American pragmatism, particularly with Charles Morris. He took part in several logical positivist projects. In other words, the Second World War scattered the most eminent philosophers of philosophy of language all over the Western world. Many of them settled in Great Britain and the United States. By spreading their views, they influenced the generations of philosophers to come. However, we should note that the analytical tradition of philosophy always faced criticism from within the tradition itself. Some of the major figures of the early analytic tradition already came under criticism from members of the Vienna Circle like Otto Neura and philosophers of science like Karl Popper. Such criticism paved way for newer formulations in philosophy of language. In this unit, we will look at the changes that happened to the philosophy of language in the mid-20th century. We will look mainly at the works of two figures, W.V.O. Quine and the later works of Ludwig Wittgenstein. They become important in the 20th century because they challenge many received views in the philosophy of language. Both Quine and Wittgenstein are regarded as two important figures for contemporary views on philosophy of language. Quine and the analytic or the synthetic distinction. As we have seen in the earlier chapters on logical positivism, one of the central tenets of logical positivism was the distinction they made between the analytic and the synthetic. Though we already know those concepts and dealt with them in detail in the earlier units, we will do a quick recap here. The logical positivists believed all genuine knowledge falls within the two realms of science: the formal sciences of logic and mathematics, the empirical sciences. According to logical positivists, the first kind of knowledge is expressed in what are called analytic propositions. The truth or falsity of these sorts of statements is based on the logical form of language or on the definition of words. In other words, in order to prove the meaningfulness of such expressions, we do not need an external experience. Examples of true analytic statements are 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. All bachelors are unmarried. Wittgenstein called all such statements tautologies. However, there are false analytic statements such as a square has 3 sides, 3 into 3 is equal to 8. Such statements are identified by the fact that they contain a contradiction within it. Tautologies or analytic prepositions are always true by their very nature and in their own terms. Contradictions are always false. So no matter what's the case, analytic statements do not give you any factual knowledge about the world. They do not add any new information to our already existing knowledge. In other words, they are statements that are true in themselves. The second class consists of empirical statements, and they are called synthetic statements. Empirical statements make claims about the world, but the difference between analytic and synthetic statements is that synthetic propositions and statements can be verified. Thus, according to logical positivism, analytic and synthetic statements are the only sorts of meaningful statements. So, any proposition that does not fall into either of these categories is meaningless. This distinction between analytic and synthetic made by logical positivism was later taken up by philosophy of language. In philosophy of language, it was applied to make a distinction between two kinds of statements. Analytic expressions or statements were true in their own terms, and synthetic statements needed to be verified through experience or empirism. This was a major concept in philosophy of language because this distinction helped to find out meaningful and meaningless sentences. This distinction was sharply critiqued by one of the later philosophers named W.V.O. Quine. Willard Van Orman Quine was an American philosopher and logician in the analytic tradition. Quine was part of the analytic philosophy tradition, but he was also the main proponent of the view that philosophy is not merely conceptual analysis. His major writings include Two Dogmas of Empirism in 1951 and The Word and Object in 1960. In Two Dogmas of Empirism, he attacked the distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. In Word and Object, he developed these positions. He introduced a very controversial concept called the indeterminacy of translation thesis. Quine is a major figure in the philosophy of science too, because he attempted to understand science from within the resource of science itself. He held that view that philosophy is continuous with science. Quine attempted to critique the very core of logical positivism and analytical philosophy by attacking the analytic or synthetic distinction. He had certain difference of view about the meanings of individual expressions. Like logical positivists, he also believed that meaning should be verified through empirical evidence, but he dismissed the idea of a meaning as a real item present in our minds. In a strongly empiricist spirit, he argued that we have no access to such things in our experience. Therefore, they could not explain our linguistic behavior, and hence they have no rightful place in our account. Quine questioned whether there was a distinction between analytic and synthetic statements at all in principle. In reviewing the prevailing ideas of analyticity, he found each one of them inadequate and unsatisfactory. Analyticity was a dogma, but if we closely examine it, it has its own problems. Moreover, the logical positivists paired analyticity with a second dogma called the empirical reductionism. Empirical reductionism is the view that we can assign each sentence or expression its own empirical content from our experience. Quine's idea of holism and the indeterminacy of translation. Instead of reductionism, Quine proposed another theory which was called the theory of holism. This theory gives importance to the system within which a sentence appears rather than the sentence within the system. Quine was against verifying each and every segment and expressions, and to him what is verified is the entire system. All scientific statements are interconnected and they are within a larger system. There is a relationship between different statements, but at the same time they also are statements of the larger system. So it will be incorrect to talk about the empirical content of a single statement. It is impossible to draw a line between synthetic statements which depend on experience and analytic statements. According to Quine, any statement can be necessarily true. To make a statement true, we have to make right changes somewhere else in the system. In this sense, any statement can be revised, and Quine argued that logical laws can be revised. He shows examples from physics to prove this. Quantum logic replaced the classical logic and Newtonian physics gave way to Einsteinian physics. Quine said that function of science is to predict future experiences in the light of past experiences. This was a very controversial idea. Quine argued that his idea of meaning and truth has two results. It blurs the division between metaphysics and natural science. It is a move towards pragmatism. Quine's claim was not to say that we should not be empirists or that empirism is insignificant. On the other hand, he argued that an individual expression cannot be seen as having its own content which determines its meaning. The sentences of our language operate in connection with one another, thus there was a holism among sentences. This was called the theory of holism. Any claim could be held true if we were willing to revise other parts of the system in which the claim appears. Some sentences cannot be revised easily, for example, the laws of logic. But according to Quine, it is because they have a central place in our present ways of thinking. Other, less central claims could be revised more easily. Thus, his ideas were focused on the concept of revisability. This idea was important to view analytic philosophy in a different light during the later half of the 20th century. The indeterminacy of translation. Another thesis proposed by Quine is the theory of indeterminacy of translation. He introduced this thesis in his 1960 book Word and Object. The indeterminacy of translation is also discussed at length in his Ontological Relativity in 1968. Quine looked at the methods available to the linguist who is attempting to translate a hitherto unknown language. He argues that there are always different ways in which one can break a sentence into words. There are different ways to distribute functions among words as well. He argues that any hypothesis of translation could be defended only taking into consideration the context. We should determine what other sentences a native would utter. The general claim of the indeterminacy of translation is that there might be different ways of translating a language. Such ways are equally correct, but at the same time they are not mere stylistic variants. Quine has given an example for this. Suppose a native speaker utters the word gavagai when he or she sees a rabbit. According to a linguist, what seems natural to the context is look a rabbit. Therefore, a linguist will translate gavagai as look a rabbit. But there can be other translations which are also meaningful in the context. Quine gives the following examples. Look, food. Let's go hunting. There will be a storm tonight. If the natives have superstitious ideas and if rabbits are associated with storms. Look, a momentary rabbit stage. Look, an undetached rabbit part. All these expressions are possible translation of the word gavagai. If we make subsequent observations, we can see that some of these expressions are less possible. Some other of the possible expressions can only be ruled out by asking questions to the natives. But for that, the linguist should have mastery over the natives' grammar and abstract vocabulary. This can only be done based on the hypothesis derived from simpler observation-connected bits of language. And those sentences on their own can have multiple interpretations. Hence, nothing that we can observe about those speakers will completely determine the correctness of one translation or others. Thus, translation is always indeterminate. The later Wittgenstein. Ludwig Wittgenstein left Cambridge in the early 1920s and pursued projects outside academia for several years. He returned in 1929 and began doing very different sorts of work. It is a matter of great debate how much affinity there is between these stages. Many philosophers of language consider that the later Wittgenstein and his earlier views were wholly different and incompatible. Others insist that there is strong continuity of themes and methods. Though his early work was widely misunderstood at the time, it is important to note that some important changes took place. In his book titled Philosophical Investigations in 1953, Wittgenstein broke with some of the theoretical aspirations of analytic philosophy. One of the key features philosophers of language from the analytic tradition is that they had strived for elegant, parsimonious logical systems. But the investigation suggested that language was a diverse, unpredictable collection of language games. Words were just so many tools to get things done in a society rather than fixed and eternal components in a logical structure. Representation, denotation, and picturing were some of the goals in playing a language game. But they were not the only ones. This can be considered as a turn in Wittgenstein philosophy. This brought in a new concern for the pragmatic dimensions of language. The view that meaning as use was often attributed to him, but we should note that there were differences in the interpretations of this view. Wittgenstein rejected a picture of language as a detached, logical sort of picturing of the facts. He brought in the question and a concern for its pragmatic dimensions. Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that words and sentences are more like game pieces or tokens. They are used to make moves in rule-governed conventional social practices. In other words, a meaning is not an abstract object. Meaning is a matter of the role an expression plays in human social behavior. To know the expressions, meaning is just to know how to use the expression appropriately in social settings. Thus, we can say the Wittgenstein's use theory is a social behavioral idea. Wittgenstein also criticized the view that linguistic expressions have direct references to things in the world. He compared linguistic activity to the playing of games. Language is not like marks on the blackboard, which has a relation to abstract entities called prepositions. Language, on the other hand, is something that people do. In that sense, language is rule-governed and conventional. Linguistic activity is governed by rules in the same way that the playing of a game is governed by rules. For example, consider expressions like hello, damn, oh, dear, excuse me, amen, thanks, stop it, you're on, and bless you. These words gain meaning not by standing for something out in the world. They are not expressing prepositions either. According to Wittgenstein, they are conventional devices for grating, expressing dismay, deploring, apologizing, endorsing, thanking, protesting, committing oneself to a bet, and blessing. They have socially defined rules. There are appropriate occasions for using them, inappropriate occasions for using them, and appropriate responses. When we talk of their meanings, we mean the functions they perform in the context of our current social practices. But he admitted that most expressions have more complicated social roles. Wittgenstein gave another example to make his point clear. A builder and his assistant use just 4 kinds of building stones. They speak a language that has just 4 corresponding words in it: block, pillar, slab, and beam. They build things using these 4 words. When the builder says slab, the assistant brings a stone of the appropriate shape. Referential theories may say that the word slab refer to a block of this shape. And propositional theories may argue that the meaning of the word slab is the proposition that the assistant is to bring such a block to the builder. But according to Wittgenstein, this would be missing the point. The word slab does have a function that is connected with blocks of that shape. But what is important is the function itself and not the referring relation. The builder makes a noise slab to get the assistant to do something. A second major development in the later Wittgenstein work was his treatment of rules. Claims about meaning reflect norms of usage, and Wittgenstein argued that it would not be possible to have a language whose meanings were accessible to only one person, the speaker of that language. Much of modern philosophy was built on the idea of a public language which comes out of private episodes. This implied that much of our initial grasp of language would also be private. According to Wittgenstein, To follow a rule, we should not limit ourselves to the private. Thus, a language intelligible to only one person would be impossible. So, let us summarize the major ideas in this topic. In this unit, we have looked at the mid-century developments in the philosophy of language. By then, the logical positivism spread outside Europe and became crucial for the development of many later theories. Though logical positivism was questioned from within, it had created its own impact in the discipline of philosophy. But by the mid-20th century, one of the major theses of logical positivism came under sharp criticism from Quine. He rejected the analytic or synthetic distinction and argued for a theory of holism. He placed importance on the larger system of language rather than the individual expressions or statements. He also developed his theory of the indeterminacy of translation. Wittgenstein also contributed to the growth of philosophy of language in his later career. He emphasized on the dimension of use in his language theories and gave importance to the pragmatic aspect of language. Now, you can attempt to answer the questions here. How did logical positivism spread outside of Europe? Discuss the political context for the spread of philosophy of language. What is the analytic or synthetic distinction? What is Quine's theory of holism? What is Quine's theory of indeterminacy of translation? What is Wittgenstein use theory? What is Wittgenstein criticism against private language? Now, you can go through these books for further reading and reference. Philosophy of Language, a Contemporary Introduction by William G. Lycan, Routledge, 2008. Descriptions, an Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, page 167 to 180 by Russell B. in 1990. London, George Allen and Unkin Limited. Two Dogmas of Empirism in From a Logical Point of View, pages 20 to 46 by Quine W. V. O. in 1953, published by Harvard University Press, Cambridge. Word and Object by Quine W. V. O. in 1960 by the MIT Press, Cambridge. Ontological Relativity in Ontological Relativity and Other Essays, pages 26 to 68 by Quine W. V. O. in 1969, published by Columbia University Press, New York. Thank you for watching this program. We can meet again with another topic. Till then, take care.